Coming up on DevelopSec, in this episode we talk about shifting left in the SDLC and how you can use that to your advantage. Tackling the challenge to integrate security into the development process? Looking for insights, answers, and practical solutions to avoid getting overwhelmed? Welcome to DevelopSec Live, where our focus is your success in securing and improving development processes. And here is your host, James Jardine. Hey everyone, welcome to this episode talking about shifting left in the SDLC. Now, we've all heard of the SDLC, hopefully, but we're starting to see more talk about shifting left when we're talking about security. So we know we have our software development lifecycle, we know we need security in our applications, and we're going to take a look at, through this quick episode, of how we traditionally have seen how we handle security within our SDLC, and then what do we mean by shifting left. And one of the things I find kind of interesting about the whole shifting left movement that's going on, ironic that we say it's a movement, but one of the things I find interesting is we don't necessarily grasp what we really want to do as far as shifting left. What we do is we have seen it as hype from vendors, right? We've gone from this buzzword to buzz phrase to say, hey, we need to start doing this. And if you want better application security, you need to shift left. But then we ask, what does shifting left mean? Does it mean I take the tool that I used to do over here on the right and I just pick it up and move it over and start doing that tool someplace on the left? What does that actually mean? So I want to take a look at a typical SDLC where we often see where we do some of this security and some of the ideas behind what we want to do as we're shifting left as we move through this. So first, let's take a look at our SDLC. Typical SDLC we've had for years. Doesn't matter what method you use, whether it's agile, whether it's waterfall, right? We have our requirements over on the left, our design. We do implementation, which is our coding phase, so we can actually write the application. We have verification, which is your QA, your testing, and then we release the item. Now, again, it doesn't matter whether this is waterfall and this is a 6-month, a year process, or whether this is agile and we're doing this very quickly and very iteratively across the board. So we have a very simple SDLC. Well, then we said, well, we need security in our SDLC. So we started creating out separate SDLCs where we said, well, we have secure development life cycles or a secure SDLC. And, you know, I've never been a real fan of separating those out. You know, why have a separate SDLC that's managed someplace else versus embedding it in? And, you know, we talk a lot about bolting on versus embedding in. And a lot of what we do in application security these days is still sort of bolting it on, right? We have a separate team called the application security team, and they manage all the security. They do all the vulnerability management. They do code reviews. They do ethical hacking. You name it, they do it. And we assume that us as regular users don't have to worry about dealing with any of that because, or as developers, because the security team's got that. Well, that's kind of a myth, right? I mean, security actually has to be a part of what we're doing when we develop our application, from the requirements phase all the way up to the release phase. But typically what we've been seeing is that we often see a lot of this stuff is being performed in the release phase. So rather than embedding it throughout the entire SDLC, we have during release, we'll say, oh, well, we'll do our penetration testing. We'll do our dynamic analysis. We'll do our static analysis. We'll do our code review. We're going to do all this right before we try to release our code. And even in a waterfall method, this is pretty harsh because, one, some of these things take a long time to do. I mean, pen testing, you're at least looking at a week and a half to 2 weeks for your typical app to have that tested, get the results back, and then trying to factor in if we've got any criticals or high issues that we need to resolve. We have to build that time in to be able to do that before we actually go release. Talk about code review could take even longer if you're doing a real code review. And I'm not talking about just running a static analysis tool, transforming it into a report and saying, hey, I did you a code review. I'm talking about a real code review where you walk through that code, you're analyzing that code manually, saying, hey, what is this authentication piece doing? What is this login piece doing? What type of risks around this? How's the code handling that? Really digging deep into that code. If you've got a large code base, that can take a while. So how are you building that in to your piece? Static analysis, dynamic analysis. Static analysis is known to return a lot of findings. So weeding through that, we need time to do that. And it doesn't make sense to wait until we're getting ready to release to run all this through. So of course, the idea is, well, we need to start shifting some of this left. Not only some of this, but we just need to start adding much more consideration to these left phases, because that's what's leading us into our application. So of course, we come out with an SDL where we've added training on the left, we've added response on the right. Both important, right? We want to make sure that we have good training for our business analysts, for our developers, for our QA. All these teams, project management needs training, right? Owners of the application, they have to have an understanding of the risks that their applications face and what that risk brings to the organization. So we have to have this understanding. Now, of course, training is a difficult thing, because what do we need to make sure we train on? Do I need to make sure that you understand as a developer how to hack and perform blind SQL injection? What about a business analyst? Do I even need to tell them what SQL injection is? Because that's a coding flaw. That's not a business analyst flaw. That's not something I'm necessarily going to put in my design documents, a requirement that says this shall not be vulnerable to SQL injection. That's all up to development and making sure that we're implementing good coding standards as we go through this. Right? So understanding what do we need for training for each of the different groups to make sure that they can perform their jobs in a way that's going to include security into what they're doing by default. Now, this isn't about taking more of the tools out of one person's hands and throwing them into another hand, trying to add burden onto another group. That's not what moving to the left is all about, right? That's not our goal when we talk about shifting left. Some people may say, oh, we're adding all kinds of burden because we're throwing these tools over there and we're throwing all these requirements over there. But that's not the case. That's not our goal when we're doing that. What we're trying to do is we're trying to spread out what we're doing so it's not all happening at once, but it's also we're trying to get in earlier. Right? If I wait till the end to run static analysis when I could be running it during the implementation phase, I'm going to get a lot more out of that static analysis during implementation than if I wait until the end. Same thing with dynamic analysis, great for the QA group. They're already running automated tools, they're already running automated testing, they're doing testing. So why not throw that type of testing into that verification phase? Because that's where it fits, we're already doing testing there. So how can we embed that in? But again, this isn't about picking up that tool, moving it over and dropping it in that spot. Okay, if I'm an organization and I decide, oh, well, we need to shift left, so I'll take my dynamic scanner and I'll just start forcing it execution in QA, but I'm still going to run it and I'll still handle the reports and I'll just, throw a PDF report over the wall. This isn't making it more efficient. We want to create better workflows. We want to make it more efficient for our development teams or our application teams to be able to get better, more secure applications out of what they're trying to do. So that's what we're trying to do. And I think a lot of places they're pushing for, okay, well, just move it. All right, you're shifting left and I'm a vendor, so we like to do a little bit of hype and we want to jump on these buzzwords and now buzz phrases. So, hey, I'm going to put shift left in all my documentation. We're going to talk shift left. We're going to talk shift left. We've been talking about this for years, not even mention it as shift left, just as embedding security into our processes and what we're doing. So it doesn't have to be a huge burden on the development team. It doesn't have to be a huge burden on the QA teams. Really what I want to see when I start talking about shifting left and start embedding into our SDLC is working with the business analysts, understanding, hey, what are you doing to define the requirements and the user stories and the use cases? However methodology you're using, what are you doing to define these things out? Now let's look and see what we can do with that to make sure that we're defining out some things that are going to take care of some of the abuse cases, some of the concerns that we have. If you're going to allow a user story that says, I want to access this account, do we have the abuse side of that to say, what happens if I try to access an account that I'm not given privilege to? Well, obviously, I want to make sure that we say if Joe tries to access Sally's account, he will get an access denied. We start doing that. We start building that security into what we're doing. Doesn't necessarily mean I need an external party to come in and sit through all my requirement meetings to lay all this stuff out. When we start thinking about these different things, we start building that in to what we're doing, and then we move on. We move on to the implementation phase, and we talk about static analysis, right? This is the big thing in there. We've had static analysis tools, as I've mentioned before in previous things, right? I've used FXCOP before. Developers use static analysis. There's all kinds of static analysis tools. And when we come to security, we decided, well, we'll create a whole bunch of other static analysis tools, and they'll only focus on security. So now we've got two sets of tools that we need to run, and we're told that we can't run the security ones because, well, you have to be an expert in security to be able to do that. And this is not true. You can run those. If I can run FXCOP, I can pick your favorite static analysis tool. I can handle the output of that. Maybe I do need a little bit of training to get up on that, but guess what? I probably need a little training to get up on FXCOP as well. For us to use these things efficiently, we need to understand how they work, and that's fine. We can pick that out and we can figure out how that's going to work. Maybe I don't want to run that tool directly as a developer. I mean, am I just going to move it into implementation and say, okay, John, you're responsible for running this tool every week? Well, that's a poor policy, I'm sure. Maybe you've got DevOps going. Maybe you've got a whole bunch of automation in these pipelines built so you can automate the process of these tools running and taking the results and dropping them over into the current bug tracking system to be able to handle that. And that's great. The more we can automate, the better we're going to be, right? The more efficient we're going to be. But we're not going to be able to do that by just taking a tool and dropping it in another location. So it's not necessarily I'm dumping this on development or I'm dumping this on QA. Maybe you've got people that are dedicated to help build these in. But that's the point, is that we're building it in. We're not just letting it free flow out there. We're actually trying to move this stuff earlier in the cycle. So that way we can start thinking about, hey, what are the threats that are with this application? What are the coding guidelines that we want around this? This is one of the big things I talk about lately, talking about development, is understanding those coding guidelines. Do you have them? Because when we start talking about code review and peer code review and making sure that we're doing things securely, well, how do I know if I'm doing something securely if I don't have it laid out in front of me? This is how we should do it securely. And I'm not talking about the vague, generic, you should output in code, you should parameterize your queries. I'm talking about getting a little bit more detailed about this and say, you know what, we're a .NET shop. We want to use XYZ component to connect to SQL Server. Here's how we should do that. Here's a code snippet of how this should look. Here's a code snippet of how it should not look. Here's our inline queries. This is vulnerable. We don't want to use this. We want to do it this way. And everybody working on our app, we're going to do it this way. And so now when we come up to code review, we can step back and say, hey, how do we want this to look? Now I can proceed and say, you know what, if this doesn't look like this, it's going to raise questions. And we want to know, why is it that we're not doing it this way? We need to update this to make sure we do it properly. I always wonder when we talk about code reviews, like, oh yeah, we do peer code review. But then you ask, well, what are your coding guidelines? How do you do a peer code review if you don't have coding guidelines? Because then what are you reviewing? Is it just up to whatever developer's reviewing it to determine, does the code look okay or does it not look okay? Did you put brackets in the right spot? Did you declare too many variables? Does somebody not like the way you declared variables? They don't like your naming? What are you comparing it to? But if we have those coding guidelines set out, now when we do our review, we can actually start comparing against those and say, yes, you're doing this right. You're outputting down to the client. You're actually including output and coding just like you should be. This looks good. That's what I'm looking to verify. But if I don't have that stuff laid out, then how do I know to do it? And we've got lots of examples of how to do things wrong. That's for sure. Go out and search how to connect to a SQL Server and query a SQL database, And you'll find definitely way more examples of how to do it insecurely than you will to do it securely. And as developers, we go out, we find this stuff, we say, hey, I need to do X. So I do a search. How do I do X? I get an example, I pull the code in because it's much easier than writing it ourselves. And I'm not downing that. I was a developer, right? I understand how it works, and I do the same thing. The point is that the problem that we see is that so many of these examples don't consider security in them, so that when you pull it down, you plug it in, and you're vulnerable. Versus if we did our textbooks talking about secure connections to the database and how to query the database in a secure manner versus just defaulting to inline queries that are vulnerable to SQL injection, we would have much less SQL injection out there. These are things that we need to consider, because if we start fixing that problem, and if we start attacking it in our dev teams from that way and saying, you know what, I'm going to build up these things. We know how we're going to build stuff. I'm going to make sure we have the right ways to do this. If I'm going to send data down, we need to make sure there's encoding around it. This is how we're going to do it. If we're going to connect to a source, this is how we're going to do it. If we're going to do X, Y, and Z, this is how we're going to approach this. So it's something that we know we're doing and we can validate. Now we bring in the tools. Now we've got dynamic analysis. We've got static analysis to verify that what it is we thought we were doing, that we thought would be secure, is actually working as we expected. That's what those tools are for. So unless you're test-driven development and you want to go that route with security, really it's building up that inside stuff, because when we build it up, then there's less chance that we're going to keep repeating those same vulnerabilities. If we flip it around and do it the other way, and we just say, hey, we're just going to code, do whatever you want, have the freedom of will, code whatever you want, and the scanner, if it finds something, you go back and fix it. Well, that's not really stopping us next time from doing it, because it may not even be you that fixes it. It may be somebody else that has to go in and fix that. So that's not of huge benefit. So when we talk about shifting left, we're not talking about, let me just pick this one piece up, keep it as is, move it over to another spot. It's great that you're moving scanning over to another spot, but really, in my mind, when I talk about shifting left in the SDLC, I'm not really talking about tools. I'm talking about embedding and building those processes up within your SDLC so that when you're going and doing things, you're actually having security in there. And you know, some of that security is actually just going to be security by default. It's not even going to be me thinking about security. Sure, from a business analyst standpoint, and I give the example of abuse cases, I'm thinking about security. I'm thinking about what can somebody do within our system that they shouldn't be able to do. We want to make sure we curb that. But when we start getting into the coding level, no longer am I thinking as much necessarily about security when I think about things like SQL injection, cross-site scripting, cross-site request forgery, XXE, name the vulnerability. I'm not thinking as much about that. I don't have to. Whereas I'm thinking more about, I want to make sure I'm building up the way we do things so that way we're not vulnerable. Whether that's picking a framework that's not vulnerable to SQL injection by default because it uses ORM type technologies, or picking a view engine that's not as vulnerable to cross-site scripting because it automatically encodes your output, so we have less of a concern there, or cross-site request forgery being built into it. But when I take something like XXE as an example, do I need to be really thinking, oh, you know what, I'm using XML, I need to think about XXE, I need to know all about it, I need to know how to attack it, I need to know what it can do, all this stuff, when really what I really need to think about is, if I'm going to use XML in my application and I'm going to use an XML parser, take .NET for example, and I'm going to do an XML document, well then I need to make sure that when I suck XML into that document object, that it's configured properly to prohibit DTDs. All right, so I'm thinking about, okay, do I need XML? Do I need DTDs within my XML or not? And then how's my parser set up to block that? And in recent versions, it's set up to block it by default. So now, unless I'm doing something crazy, and the system's now going to jump out and say, this is blocked, you're going to do this, you're going to open yourself up, right? Now I need to understand that. But in most cases, really all I need to know is when I set up and use XML, I want to configure my parser in a certain way. So when we go and look at our guidelines, we have guidelines that say, if you're going to use XML, here's the steps you need to take. But I'm not harping all into the depths of security and all the risks and all this stuff around it. What I'm doing is I'm laying out from actually a coding perspective, hey, here's how we need to make sure that we're coding this. Make sure that your parser is not going to parse DTDs, right? And then now we can take that, we can build those type of checks into our QA processes if we need to, or we can use the tools that we have, whether it's dynamic analysis, static analysis, interactive analysis. We got enough tools out there to help us all over the place to verify that we did that. But I don't have to be thinking about all these different terminologies that are going on, right? It's about shifting into our processes, building these things up that rather than being a burden and being more work, hopefully in the end, once we get this up and going, it'll actually be less work. It'll be more efficient. It'll be more streamlined, less of a headache to deal with because so many things are now just taken care of for us. I don't have to sit there and do so much thinking outside the box about, oh, how am I doing the security of my application? Because we've spent the time to build up how we want to do this. And I think that's what we're trying to think about when we're talking about shifting left in the SDLC. And again, it doesn't matter whether you want to call it DevOps, DevSecOps, SecDevOps, or you pick whatever way you want to put those three terms together. Doesn't matter. The idea is that we're moving it into the processes. And in another episode, I'm going to talk about some of the differences between, okay, what is your application security team doing? What is your application team doing? And what is some of that stuff that we can juggle around that maybe doesn't make sense for one team to be doing or having full responsibility for, that we could be more efficient if we move that to another spot. This is one of the reasons I feel like we have, this mythological talent shortage out there, because a lot of the stuff we're trying to fill for doesn't necessarily have to be in that spot. So that's something we want to work on. And that's something that as an organization, as you mature your organization, you'll find that you'll start to realize where things fit, what ways they fit best, and what's going to work together the most to be able to give you a more secure development environment. It's not just about throwing plugins and throwing tools in different locations with the environment. It's actually about looking at your SDLC, looking at the phases, look at how you design and build your applications, and figure out what's going to work best in your environment to make it most efficient to start doing more secure applications. So that's really what we're talking about when we think about all this and as we go through this. So hopefully if you've got thoughts on shifting left, I'd love to hear more of the conversation. Let me know if you want to join into the Slack channel, if you've got comments, maybe if you just want to shoot them out on Twitter, just hit me up at DevelopSec on Twitter, or you can reach me, james@developsec.com via email. I'd love to hear your thoughts because listen, this is an open conversation. There's new things that are coming out. There's new ways of doing things. Everybody has different ideas, and I don't think there's any ideas we want to overlook. I think what we need to do is we need to throw them out on the table, and we need to analyze them a little bit. We need to talk about them. I'm not saying I'm right on everything out there, that's for sure, right? But I want to think differently than what we've been doing, because what we've been doing hasn't really been working all that well. Let's think about how we can build this in to try to reduce the pain, increase the security, and increase the morale. And I think that's our goal for doing that. So thanks for tuning in to this episode. The recording will be up in just a little bit out on YouTube, so in case anybody missed it, feel free to send them a link and they can check it out. But until then, we'll catch you on